All right.
Sorry to be lost.
I want to move us along so we'll make sure we have time for our lunch break. Hi, my name is Eugene Raikhel. I'm a current faculty member in Comparative Human Development, and I'm very pleased to be chairing the session of a panel of former postdocs. The format is going to be the same as the previous one. We're going to have 4 speakers, each talking for about 7 minutes, then a discussant, and then we'll open it up to discussion with the audience. So our speakers today, the first will be Joan Miller, who's a professor of psychology at the New School for Social Research. Our second will be Rebecca Lester, who's associate professor of anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. Then Bambi Chapin, who is associate professor of anthropology at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And finally, Timothy Cage Hall, who's assistant clinical professor in the Department of Family Medicine at UCLA. And then we'll have comments from Micere Keels, who is associate professor in the Department of Comparative Human Development. Do you want to come up, or?
Probably okay here. Is that, yeah, this is working, the mic is working? Okay, so I'm pleased to get the chance to talk, but I feel like a little bit of an interloper on this panel, or maybe that's not the right word. I somehow I identify as a graduate of human development and working with Rick, and I was technically a postdoc, but the postdoc was actually, interestingly, part of me hanging on the university as I was on the job market, and I think people do postdocs that way. I think it achieved the postdoc goal of actually introducing me to a new field of moral development that was different than my dissertation and affected my career. But what I think my comments are very much a mix of speaking from being a student here and a little bit of being a postdoc. I also feel that, I mean, this is going to maybe happen with everyone, that we're really talking about the same thing, and there's a little bit of repetition with twists. So I think one of the striking things about Chicago was, and human development, was its the breadth of perspectives, and people have been talking about that, a real interdisciplinary program that I think as a student here, you got exposed to different fields, and you knew the importance of these different fields. You knew that, I mean, there was sociology and biology and anthropology as somebody interested in psychology, and you knew that there are, in a sense, multiple ways of looking at something. You know where to look, but also sort of realizing with a kind of humility you can't know everything, and there's sort of a humility and a recognition of the breadth of outlook. So I think that was a very important thing to take away from Chicago. Thinking about examples of this, I thought of my final dissertation, I guess it was defense, the final meeting on the project, and remember that it went well. I mean, nobody had any major revisions, or I think Don Fisk had some grammar suggestions, but sort of the intellectual intensity of that experience. There was this real interesting sense that everybody had something to say. Everybody disagreed, found some fundamental flaw that was interesting and bringing a different perspective, and thinking very much more deeply about the kind of work I had done. Dan Friedman, work looking at cultural influences on social attribution, and me explaining it, and in differences I found in sort of a symbolic cultural orientation. But Dan Friedman sort of raising questions. How do you know these cultural differences really aren't based on inborn genetic differences between populations? Me arguing for a symbolic interpretation of culture, somebody like Fred Strobeck pushing for how can't you explain these differences in evolutionary terms, in terms of differences in the societal levels of societal development between the US and India. And McKim Marriott, raising perhaps the most profound critiques or insights, this idea, well, you've drawn from anthropology, but maybe you've kind of screwed it up. You're engaging in comparison, but what terms are you using in these comparisons? And really making the suggestion, if you really started from a more monistic Hindu-Indian outlook, everything would look very, very, very differently. And he was right, it would absolutely. But coming out of that, without any, any need to revise anything, but certainly a really exciting kind of intellectual perspective that I think we've all been talking about. The other, and maybe this is a related point, I think I've always I find people whose work I like. I mean, whether I meet these people or not, I find work, I think maybe we all do this a little bit, work that I think is really, really interesting. And I think what's always intriguing to me is how many people, I like their work, I find it really interesting, and I learned later that they actually were here at Chicago, the Committee on Human Development. I think there's a depth of interesting questions and sort of a depth in the perspective that people take. Okay, but in terms of, I guess, maybe challenges or just how human development fits in the larger picture of disciplines, or just thinking about the larger picture of disciplines. Just talking, when is this idea of an interdisciplinary perspective? And certainly human development is genuinely interdisciplinary. But I also think that even when I was here at Chicago, I was struck by, even at that point in time, and certainly remaining to the present, how closed, in my case, closed anthropology was. It really wanted nothing to do with psychology. In a sense, the whole paradigm of comparison, of empirical work, of just the methods and approaches leading arguably, I mean, I don't know if it's an intolerance, but certainly leading to a challenge in how interdisciplinary can one be. And I mean, and sort of this idea whether we're talking to ourselves, and is there any way? I don't know. I guess I feel it's very, very strong with anthropology and psychology, and maybe less of an issue in other fields. But is there any way to bridge that? And my sense over time doesn't seem likely. It doesn't seem to be the case. I don't sound negative here, but the other point I think was raised both in Bob's talk and Tanya's talk this morning, just a few minutes ago. This idea of, well, two related ideas. One the idea of resistance, and I maybe speak from my own perspective, where I think I've been very impressed over time, maybe more than I thought, how resistant, as a psychologist, how resistant psychology is to a cultural perspective. How, if anything, psychology, maybe it's not moving, it's past the, obviously it's past the behavior, embrace of behaviorism in the 20th century, but it seems to be certainly still intrigued by a natural science or a physical science ideal, and embracing neuroscience to moving in that direction, if anything, a direction that, if anything, is, I think, in the opposite direction, at least as it's being instantiated, not inevitably, but as it's being instantiated, to taking into account culture or taking into account interdisciplinarity. And then I think an issue that Tanya spoke about in her talk, the idea of audience, the idea of how do we speak to different audiences? And I know that my own personal answer to this was somehow this belief that I wanted to be a culturally sensitive psychologist, but I wanted to speak to psychology, envisioning the path to do this as one where you embrace, not in a condescending way, but sort of embrace the strengths of mainstream methodology. You speak to it, frame things in terms that can be understood in a particular field, can be published in mainstream journals in that field, with the idea that that may be a way to move this larger field, that engaging could broaden the discipline. I'm not sure that really happens, but I think that has been my solution. But I think more broadly, you know, to the extent that we are moving to mainstream or approaches of other disciplines, you know, is that necessarily the best way to go? And are we losing our own, you know, if you do something that is rich and insightful, and then somebody says, well, that's just a story. You know, maybe you got something from that story, but then how do you bridge the insights from that story or that anecdote to speak to other groups? And one last point, you know, just this interesting idea of comparison, which I still say HD because that's what it was, but I certainly embrace the idea of comparison, but I think that certainly is part of the challenge. How do we speak to larger communities with our work? Okay.
I'm Rebecca Lester, and I was a postdoc here in HD from 1999 to 2000, which, my gosh, is a long time ago. It doesn't feel like it was that long ago, but it was during the transition that John Lucy was talking about this morning, and at the time I didn't realize that, you know, what had just happened and what was going on. I just knew that we had a different chair every year that I was here, and I thought that was a little unusual that, you know, maybe that's how they do it in Chicago, I don't know. And it was interesting deciding to come here. I was in the fortuitous position of being able to choose between two postdocs. So I was deliberating, do I come here or do I take this other postdoc? And I remember very clearly my phone conversation with Rick when he was trying to persuade me to come to Chicago, and, you know, telling me about all the wonderful things about HD and the interdisciplinarity, and we have this beautiful old building and you should really come and spend your time in Chicago. And I should say, as far as Rick goes, when people find out that I did a postdoc here and that I worked with Rick, I often get these big eyes, like, you worked with Rick Schrader, and what was that like, and what's he like, and oh my gosh, how you're still standing, and what's... And it was not my experience at all of Rick, who has always been extremely warm and supportive, and just a huge support to me. So I get a lot of props from my colleagues when they hear that we have a good relationship. So I appreciate that. But the thing that really persuaded me to come here to HD was not coming to be trained in any one discipline, as we've been talking about all yesterday and today, but really being trained to learn how to think in a different way, in a more complex way, in a deeper way. Not so much to find, you know, certain answers to things, but to really learn how to ask good, interesting questions. And that, to me, at this kind of pivotal point in my professional development at the time, seemed like what was really the important move to make. So that's how I ended up coming to HD. And when I was here, I mean, postdocs are amazing. Unfortunately, there aren't that many of them around anymore, but I got protected time for writing that now I would kill for. We taught one class. I developed a class here at HD called Gender, Culture, and Madness that I still teach today, 16 or however many years later. Just taught it this past fall. So it really shaped how I took the next steps in my career. I finished the book I was working on while I was here, and I made a pivot to my next project, looking at strategies of care and theories of change in eating disorder treatment in the United States, and that's kind of been my trajectory since then in moving into Washington University at St. Louis. But HD also really primed me for another important pivot or step, I guess, in my career, which was after I was at WashU and got the book done and out and all of that, I decided to pursue clinical training. So I got my Master of Social Work and pursued my clinical supervision and got a licensure in clinical social work, and I work as a psychotherapist in conjunction with my work as an anthropologist. And this was something that seemed to make perfect sense to me, having been at HD. This was, of course, that's what the next step would be for the kinds of things I was interested in. But at WashU, this was very bizarre, and it was a little bit of a challenge to kind of demonstrate to my anthropology colleagues that no, this kind of interdisciplinary work is not only possible, but fruitful and extremely necessary for the kinds of questions that I learned how to ask while I was here. And so I will say that now I have my own students who are going through their training. My very first PhD student just published her first book. And in reading that, I see the influence of human development on my thinking and how that has impacted her thinking, even without her necessarily knowing it. But I see HD in her work and in my other students' work, and that's incredibly gratifying. And I think just a testament to the richness and the depth of this program here. So I'll just end by saying it was fantastically wonderful and enriching experience that profoundly shaped my own human development. And I'm deeply, deeply grateful for having been here. Thank you.
So I'm Bambi Chapin, and I was here as a postdoc from 2003 until 2006. And I've been trying to think about what is useful to say. And I think from a postdoc position, you're kind of, because we just kind of pop in, we're not trained here as graduate students and we're not doing the training. And so maybe it's helpful to hear some of what HD feels like from the outside and in a comparative kind of way. And for me, coming from anthropology, where my cohort of people I was in graduate school with, as well as the faculty, were interested in what seems to me quite a larger diversity of subjects, but with a more limited set of methods and theories. And so for me, coming to HD, it felt like, oh, everyone's studying the same thing. And so it's been interesting to hear people talk over the past, since last evening about how diverse HD is. And what felt to me that was a real strength and a real, I don't know, I want to say something silly, like eye-opening, right? It was really a place of growth and challenge for me, is finding all of these people who were interested in thinking about human development in cultural and social context and the shaping of that over the life course and the shaping of minds and beings and lives. And that, as a focus, felt a very unifying focus. And that then people had all of these different methods that they approached this with, and all of these different theoretical resources and tools and training to think about that, which were much broader than my training in cultural anthropology, both the methods and the theories. And yet this had been my question, and I particularly have looked at lives in Sri Lanka and child rearing and how culture gets passed on, or now I'm thinking about how it also gets changed and mixed up. So having it felt like a shared focus, right? And I do think that's a different kind of perspective than other folks have had about this. One of the methods that I really valued that HD, many people at HD had, both faculty and grad students, and Rebecca, was inspired to take this up as well, is a clinical training, right? Where I think having those theoretical tools was very helpful for me, but also having those methodological ones so that people were really trained and practiced in listening. That's a little bit broader than an open-ended interview, right? Really listening over time to the same person over time, and being able to think about that life, and then having the context to think about that within HD, how that fits into their world and patterns and resources. Clinical ethnography group with Bert was incredibly helpful, and a place that I developed a lot of work that I've been doing since then. I also had a little bit of the same experience Tanya spoke about of, I wasn't, unlike Rebecca, I didn't, and I could kick myself for this, I didn't spend a lot of time writing here. I spent a lot of time going to amazing lectures and reading other people's papers, reading grad students' papers and proposals, and it was so, I felt like I lived in this candy store where there was always so much intellectual vibrancy going on. But I wouldn't be, the work that I've done since then, and I've been sort of in page numbers more productive, thankfully, since then, it was all, none of that, I couldn't have done any of that work without the contributions of all of that richness from HD and from Chicago. I felt a little bit like I'd come to intellectual finishing school in a kind of way. One of the other things that I appreciate about HD, but I also appreciated especially within the context of the University of Chicago and my experience here, is the emphasis on kind of plain talk that I think an interdisciplinary approach really requires, and it's part of what is so fruitful about the kind of conversations that HD has been having for a long period of time. You can't say things in coded disciplinary talk, you have to translate it. And when you do, sometimes you realize, oh, that's a kind of dumb idea. Or, actually, those are 5 ideas. Which one do I mean, right? Or, oh, my idea sounds very simple, but the person hearing it, who comes from a different discipline, is like, oh, wow, that is an amazing thought, right? Here's how I would think about it. So real communication. And it's scary, because you're leaving aside these kind of veils that I think sometimes we talk within. But for me also, Chicago's anthropology department is sort of like, the anthropology department, and it's where a lot of fancy talk comes. And so, I remember sort of coming to the first, when I came here visiting as a graduate student, following Tanya to work on my dissertation, writing up my dissertation, and I would sneak into the anthropology colloquia and sit there thinking, I don't know anything anybody's saying, what are they saying, right? And then being like, oh, wait, I get what they're saying, right? And then, oh, I'm excited about those ideas now that I can understand them in a different way, because I came from an anthropology program that was a little more plain talking and influenced by HD, right, in its own way as people came back and forth, right, between there. So the methods, the plain talk, I think there's also a tremendous amount of freedom, and I hope the graduate students feel that here. Because you're at Chicago, you can take more chances and know that you will be recognized as a legitimate academic later, and that is a real asset. So people are taking chances and are kind of doing something that might not identify you or set you up as a member of a discipline right at first. That if you were at a less prestigious place, you wouldn't have the chance perhaps to do. And that's a real benefit. I hope people take advantage of that and continue to take advantage of that, of the kind of courage, the sort of freedom, a real academic freedom that you have, and that I appreciated about being here. And I think the thing that has been most helpful to me, and that again feels like both a focus of study, as well as a resource and what keeps HD so important to those of us who have come in and out of it and have it continue, is relationships. Right. So right away when I came here, it seemed like one of the things that everyone was talking about, at least at that time, and that was really important to my work, is really looking at relationships. So not the individual or the society, right, or the cultural heritage, but how that plays out in the ground of interaction over time, and how that shapes people in really fundamental ways. And that as the unit of analysis was something that a lot of us were talking about, and that was really helpful for me, and that I continue to think about in my work, especially as I think about sort of how culture changes, right, in some of those relationships. But it's also the relationships that I formed with people here, with faculty, with students, with people who became both my intellectual colleagues and my deep personal friends. that is amazing, and I think I'm reminded of that, even people who I don't know, or haven't met yet rather, who are here, who've been speaking, and we have a kind of shared community and a set of resources that are professionally and personally and intellectually incredibly rewarding. When I first came here, I met with Richard Taub, who was the chair at the time. He was the chair the whole time I was here. And he said to me, I said, well, what do you see as my role here as a postdoc? Besides doing my own work, like, what's my role here? And he said, I think you should be involved in the life of the department. And I took that as my mission and authorization. And that has been incredibly enriching, and I just want to say thank you, and I hope that you all have and are continuing to enjoy that membership, whether we're physically present or gone, as much as I have. So thanks.
I'm Cage Hall. I was in Bambi's cohort at UC San Diego in psychological anthropology, although I came here about 2 years later as I was finishing my medical school training. And even though I was only here for 2 years, it feels like I have had a much longer relationship with HD. Rick may not remember this, but when I was a graduate student doing fieldwork in Czech Republic in 1998 or 1999, I emailed him asking for a reprint copy of an article that he had written that Roy Andrade had talked about very highly. HD in general, both its alumni and its faculty, figured very highly in the intellectual imaginary at UC San Diego. And I was with limited internet access, and this was before the era when you could easily get many journal articles online, and Rick graciously sent me a copy. And then, of course, I was able to come here for about 3 or 4 months right when I'd returned from field work, because Tanya had just come here a year before and had arranged for a couple of us to spend some time here. And I taught a class in gender studies and got to meet a number of the incoming graduate students or early graduate students from a couple cohorts around then, who have gone on to become, yes, both deep personal friends and major intellectual interlocutors in my time since then. So I was thrilled to have the opportunity to then come here a few years later as a postdoc, first on Linda Waite's T32 over at the Committee on Aging for a year, and then in Rick's program here. And it was a really amazing experience. I remember a conversation that I had with Martha McClintock where she was talking about the distinction between multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity. And multidisciplinarity is a bit like parallel play. You get people from different backgrounds together, and they each sort of take a different chunk of something, and you may very well get a more interesting or useful or insightful or novel product out of it than what you would get if you had one person from one discipline doing it. But real interdisciplinarity is when people are really seriously engaging one another and figuring out what would be different, what's the synergy of actually merging or interfacing those different disciplines. And HD is one of the few places that I think really gets it right for interdisciplinary social sciences most of the time. It's very hard to do. It helps that it's embedded in the University of Chicago generally, which is so wonderfully interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary. And I have definitely missed that in other places that I have been. Harvard is highly siloed. And UC San Diego and UCLA are fairly clearly demarcated into separate departments and divisions and tracks within those departments in comparison to what it is here. Let's see. One of the biggest things for me here actually was the life of the department, as Bambi is saying, particularly instantiated, I think, in the various workshops, where you really had a wonderful engagement of very astute, sometimes highly critical, but in generally a very constructive way, people engaging on cutting-edge issues in various disciplines. That is something that I have also very much missed at UCLA. Partly it's the medical school is simply not as intellectual as an academic department like this, as some people seem to know. But also it's maddening after my immersion in the culture of critique and engagement at Chicago, to be sitting in a grand rounds lecture or CME or go to a conference, and I'm just sitting there wanting to engage the speaker on, but that's lovely, but you set up the problem wrong, or you're not telling us crucial context as to what might or might not be going on here, so I have no way to interpret what's going on with this. And that was something that was always present at HD and was really wonderful. Remember, it was something of a joke. It was an unusual experience if presenters at various colloquia actually got to the end of their prepared talk, unless they were very familiar with the department, because they'd be derailed onto various sorts of side questions about methods or context or other things that had come up, which was really wonderful. What else? So many things. I think one of my biggest points of engagement here was clinical ethnography and Bert Kohler, who I'm sure people have talked about a bit yesterday, but he was a lifer here for some 40 years, and really an amazing mentor for me and for a number of other people. And the evenings with Tanya and Rick and Dr. Orlinsky and Dr. Fisher and a number of other people were just really amazing, particularly for me. I'd come out of somewhat of a mixed disciplinary background. Undergraduate was at Harvard in history and literature, which is sort of a social history interdisciplinary program. And then they did an MD and a PhD in psychological anthropology, which has left people deeply puzzled as to why I did not consider myself a medical anthropologist for many years, because I was separately trained in the two and not in the interface. And then here, particularly in clinical ethnography, but also in the cultural life course in mental health, it really came together, and there was really finally a group of people, an audience, where you could have these wonderful, exciting conversations about what does this really mean? What does it really mean to say that someone's crazy? What does it really mean to say so many things that people take for granted in their daily life and in their daily disciplinary activity? And that was something that I have looked back on very fondly. It has certainly shaped my intellectual development. I'm not sure. I think that in the interest of opening this up for discussion, I'll just bring this to a close and look forward to conversations from the audience and conversations this evening.
And then opening it up to the audience. I think I'm loud enough, usually.
Everyone thinks they're loud enough, but.
So, can you guys hear me in the back, or do you need me to use the mic? Okay, will do. So my one question before starting to opening up, actually a comment and a question, which is that Martha has started with, he's saying talking about multidisciplinary and then interdisciplinary, and now talks about being, my bad. Sorry. And then talks about being transdisciplinary. I'll make sure that I keep my elbow in the mic in place. Talks about being transdisciplinary at this point, which is, as some of you have indicated in the undertones of what you were saying, of starting from the question, and then using the question to guide where you go to look for theoretical frameworks. And so, which is something that definitely runs through all of what you were saying. But my question is, in some ways, talking about doing the reverse of what you guys did and thinking about current CHD students. And what advice would you give them about going from being in an interdisciplinary department to possibly doing postdocs in places that may be much more disciplinary in their orientation?
Should we take that up, or do you have other things to say?
No, that's my question, and then we'll open it up. So whoever.
So I would definitely recommend that. There aren't a lot of postdocs in cultural anthropology and psychological anthropology, but if you want to pitch yourself as an anthropologist, that would be a great thing to do, because I do think it is a very different kind of experience. And one of the things that I actually appreciate about my disciplinary training is that I have a very strong sense of being involved in a conversation that has unfolded over the past, 120 years. And what those questions are, what those themes are, I mean, I continue to discover them, and I routinely have to be reminded and forget what, Talcott Parsons said, or whatever. But having this kind of sense of being involved in a conversation, if you want to enter a conversation, it's great to find out what that conversation is, what people are talking about, what counts as data. Not abandoning the things that you already knew, but adding to that so that you can participate in that conversation too. And I guess that's mainly my thought on that. Anybody else? Go ahead.
One thing that I would say is that in my impression of the professional development at HD has been that it is generally very good. It is much better than what we had at UCSD, although UCSD has gotten their act together since then. But in general, I think that you do a very good job of doing professional development here for interdisciplinary and specific disciplinary graduate students. My advice, one bit of advice to graduate students would be, obviously, it is a wonderful thing if you can find a department that has a track record of dealing with people doing unusual edge of the discipline or discipline interfacing things, or a sympathetic department chair. That seems to be, having talked to a bunch of people doing MD PhDs in social sciences, that seems to be key to having any sort of a viable career. But also looking at a couple of graduates of HD that I have known, if you can find a sympathetic department, that obviously makes a huge difference. But it is really worthwhile and necessary to figure out how to explain why what you're doing, let's assume that you do mixed methods or mostly qualitative stuff, and you're going into a largely quantitative field or quantitative department, or your research topics are not necessarily core to what most of that field is doing. I think it's really important to get a fairly polished way of explaining to people in that discipline why what you're doing is important and why it counts as data, and possibly what additional insights this might be bringing. I had a lovely time actually taking a multiple regression class here. And ironically learned there how to explain to the quantitative people. One of the, this of course was a University of Chicago statistician, so she was like, oh yeah, qualitative stuff, sure, quantitative stuff is just some qualitative incidents. And also talking with Ed Lauman about similar sorts of things. But it's really helpful if you can make use of the resources here to figure out how to talk to at least the smart people in the other disciplines that you're trying to go into. They will see the value of your work if you can figure out how to explain it to them.
Any other comments on this?
And again, I'm just negative over here, but I think it's harder than we're portraying it, actually, in a real way. And it's not just talking. Explaining and portraying the value of what you're doing, but it's almost, I guess the world in a funny way is not the University of Chicago. The world is more an academic world of departments, and I think within these departments it's really easy to exclude somebody and really not see the relevance of what they're doing. And I think the same thing with, I remember the first paper I published coming out of here, and it wasn't my dissertation, but because that was all spiffy, but another paper, and getting reviews and just understanding. It's not just talking, it's actually putting things in methodologically sound ways, and I don't think it's just, we want to avoid the condescension of, we're just going to talk in their terms, but their terms aren't really valuable. I think in some way, one needs to embrace a maybe almost embrace the discipline and try to, this is my own outlook, and try to broaden it, but not to imagine that we're going to stand in this genuinely interdisciplinary perspective in departments that are disciplines. So maybe my thing is, I think I spiffed up on wanting to be in a psychology department. I spiffed up on methodologically what it would take, and I didn't feel that spiffing up was selling my soul. Yeah.
Are there any other postdocs first? Anyone that came here as a postdoc? Yes, okay. Just wanted to allow those individuals to maybe have a comment or question.
Thank you. My name is Basha Ellis, and I have, yes, arrived here as a postdoc in October, late October, and working with Rick and so many graduate students, and I've just loved my experience here so far, and it's so, it's so much like the themes that I'm picking up on in all these conversations, the open spirit, the real genuine pursuit of knowledge, the conversations, the brilliant people, etc. And I'm happy to go on about that, but I won't. I have a question, and maybe in a way I am paralleling or already learning the spirit of University of Chicago by countering the last comment that was made about the difficulty of bringing this kind of spirit into other departments. So I came out of I finished my PhD in theoretical and social psychology in Canada. I was part of a small department, and we were pretty ostracized in this department. There was about 3 graduate students. I worked with a brilliant professor, Hank Stam, who had its theory in psychology, and I learned a lot from that experience, but I didn't have the kind of context that I have here, which is really remarkable. And I think, you know, the persons who mentioned that it's very true that it's very representative of the university itself as well. And I'm enjoying that thoroughly. I'm wondering about moving that spirit into another department and what it takes to really push that along. And maybe I'm still, you know, naive. I'm going to hit some wall and realize that it's very difficult, like you just mentioned. But I want to, so my countering is really saying, well, what do we do, or what have you done with that spirit in your next steps, and what does that look like institutionally, relationally? You know, what does it take, and if you can comment on that.
I can say for me, I came into a department that had, it's an anthropology department, three fields, so sociocultural, archaeology, and physical anthropology. And I was hired as a medical anthropologist, which is not how I identify, but you know, it fit with what they were looking for. And for me, it was just a matter of continuing to do my work the way that I felt like it needed to be done. And that, like I mentioned before, you know, ran into some, I wouldn't say walls exactly, but some resistance and some pushback and some challenges. And I had to be really clear for myself about what my priorities were with my research and in my professional development, and to be ready to stand by that and to do what I thought was necessary. And over time, I mean, fortunately I have a department that is actually highly functional and people like each other, and you know, that helps a lot. So that earned me some patience and grace and some consideration as I kind of went through this process, but they were able to see, you know, over time how that works. So in my case, it was being lucky to be in a supportive department, but also just kind of plowing ahead and doing what needed to be done. And then since then, there's been a lot more kind of like, oh, that's interesting, and maybe we'll have a joint PhD MSW program, and maybe we'll, you know, do this, that, and the other thing. And so it has kind of helped, I think, shift a little bit how people think about interdisciplinary work.
So I think that perhaps the three of us are in, and you as well, are in less of a good position to answer this than people like Joan, or other people who have come out of HD and gone into disciplines, right? Because then you know kind of more what that's like. I can imagine what it would be like, and I know the graduate students that I have worked with who have cultivated an identity as an anthropologist and who have found placements as an anthropologist, and the kind of work that they needed to do. But I think that the point that you make, Joan, is a really important one, which is like a real respect, right, and a membership, not a kind of sort of rejection and a condescension and oh, I knew a little bit about that, so that's good enough, and you should hire me, because there are real conversations. But I do think that's what HD does well, which is a sense of real interdisciplinarity, right? I think John Lucy is sort of classically said over and over, right, that being interdisciplinary means you have to master several disciplines, right? It doesn't mean you get to half master a little bits of the pieces that you want and, you know, kind of like think that's the only thing worth doing, right? But a real respect, and you know, it could be why people take a long time sometimes, right? Because that's a lot of work to do, as John Lucy is perhaps an example.
I am sure that was said with love. So,
Utmost respect, yes.
so additional.
Yeah, I'm Nancy Siegel, human development graduate in 1982, and I've had kind of the opposite experience of the postdoc sitting here, because I graduated and then went to a 3-year postdoc at the University of Minnesota, where I worked on the study of twins raised apart, and it was a spectacular experience. But I couldn't help notice the difference between the department there and what was going on here. There's a lot of talent, but it's very compartmentalized, and you could seek it out, but you had to make a greater effort. And what always mystified me, and still does to this day, is how the Department of Psychology had almost no connection to the Child Development Institute, which was just across the road. And I used to go to the seminars there and found them very, very useful, and learned a great deal.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I've had a lot to say, but I couldn't ignore, what am I doing? I couldn't ignore the,
Maybe it's not working.
it's on, I think.
It's pretty close, you can't see.
I'll project my voice. I couldn't ignore the fact that several people mentioned the University of Chicago Anthropology Department, which I was in, as well as human development and first of all, I want to say that Kim Marriott, it was the easiest guy.
Oh, absolutely,
in the
yeah.
Anthropology department to have, in terms of toleration and interest in psychological work.
Absolutely.
But they only got worse when you, as far as toleration. But there was a moment, I don't want anybody to forget this, when Mel Spiro was here. And that, for me, of course, that was heaven, because he was a mentor of mine. We were never at the same university until I came here. When he couldn't get back into Burma, he agreed to come to Chicago in the anthropology department. I guess, Dave Schneider, I wasn't part of the decision-making, but I was so happy that Mel was here, and we taught a seminar together with Ray Fogelson in 1965, and I thought that the world is going to change here at the anthropology department. It's going to change totally because Mel was there. But what happened is that he was offered the possibility of starting a new department in La Jolla. And you know the rest of the story. You two from UCSD, he created a department devoted to psychological anthropology. And I know there's all kinds of problems. There may have been problems with that department, but whatever. He had in it all those wonderful people like Obia Sekra and so on. But the point is, I just want to keep in mind that piece of history that at one moment, Chicago was about to have a genuine psychological anthropology program, and but it got transferred to San Diego.
Given, can I just comment some of that? Well, I mean, Mary, I attended his seminar sort of on an ongoing basis while I was here, and he was one of the most open people. And actually, when he made comments to me, they made total sense. And I mean, I always thought Kim Marriott was totally one of the most genuine, Kim Marriott. But I remember going, I'm going to go off to India, and Rick had said, I mean, I knew some anthropology, and I'd been in Marriott's ongoing South Asian Conceptions of the Person seminar for a long time, but directed me to talk to, I think, to Fullerson, actually. I'm going to go to, I'm not going to, I was going to be there for 8 months. I'm a good guy psychologist. I'm going to go and try to, I mean, that's how I felt myself. And, ask him what, any advice he could give. I would have an opportunity to hang out there, to do a mini kind of version of field work. And basically the advice was, don't go. I mean, that essentially was it. There's nothing I can say to you. You're doing comparison. You're coming back with numbers. You're quantifying it. I think that, I mean, to give you another example, I was yes, because I was going to India. Marriott was relevant to knowing about India. He was relevant too. I was at Yale and teaching a seminar, a seminar on cultural psychology, and there was a clinical student in it who wanted to study stress and coping. And I knew a colleague in anthropology at Yale then who was teaching a more anthropological version of a cultural psychology. And I said, why don't you, stress and coping, why don't you try to make contact with this faculty member whom I knew to, maybe he can point to different ways to broaden your outlook, this notion of stress and coping. And she got back, stress and coping is a very Western concept. There is nothing you can do. I mean, just sort of this wall. I can't even let you into this community because you're going to go in sort of a half-baked way or a partial way. And I could go on with 15 million other examples, but that kind of thing. That's where I'm going.
Hi, I'm Judith Torney-Perta, and as soon as I graduated from human development, I taught for the next 14 years in psychology departments. And so I want to try to link what Nancy said over here about the insularity of Minnesota, which I've always wondered about too, the psych department and the child study, but with what Joan said at the beginning. And from the interests of those in the audience who identify first as psychologists and then have tried to make more anthropological and cultural propositions and issues more relevant to psychology, if we can do any forward thinking about how to do that, because it is, I mean, there is an international psychology division in APA, but I wouldn't hold it up necessarily as a model, because it really isn't interdisciplinary. It's a group of people, many of them from other countries, who have interesting perspectives, but it doesn't have any of this broader sort of dialogue or discourse involved. What can we do for the psychology and psychologists in this way, from our understanding that has come out of this university and department?
I don't mean to. I think there's sort of two different issues. I mean, one certainly is this issue, and that is something I've always have been interested in and continue to be interested in, trying to to broaden psychology so it takes culture more seriously in its constructs and methods and conclusions. And I think just try. I think there's hope, but I also think there's a lot of resistance, and that's what I was trying to articulate a little bit. I mean, just even within the discipline, that there's a lot of resistance. The culture really is not on people. That's not part of the classic agenda. But I mean, maybe over time, and psychology is getting more international, I think, which it really, I think, is in terms of people, psychologists, doing work. I remain a little bit optimistic, or I feel we're making steps. But I think the other issue I was talking about was this interesting, it's a slightly different issue, which is I've been so struck by how the resistance is somebody working, thinking that anthropology or some insights from anthropology are relevant, or at least to broaden, to understand culture in a better way than how psychologists would approach it as individualism, collectivism, or something, horrible like that, or simplistic like that. But sort of pointing to, this is a slightly different thing than trying to, I guess I think that I've just been struck by the wall building. Maybe it for sure goes both ways, but the way I experience it is anthropology, not, even psychological anthropologists really not having much respect, seeing much value in even cultural psychology, quantitative people, and this sort of, there's nothing I can tell you, there's no way to translate the insights we have through in-depth ethnographic work into the kind of comparisons you guys do. I think those are two, I don't think drawing an anthro is going to get us there in a funny way. I think it's a harder path.
So maybe I do tend to be a little more Pollyanna about things, so maybe you can take that with that piece. But I actually think that's what's awesome about what's going on at HD, right? Is that it is hard to have these conversations across disciplines. And here, as a committee, right, if not by name, by spirit, that we are committed to, if I may use the we here, to having those difficult conversations of setting aside those disciplinary prejudices, of trying to challenge each other. And it is not always, yay, we're all in this together. A lot of it, times it's conflictual, but it's engaged. And I think that's one of the things that's emerged, and that's one of the things that's so incredibly productive, is developing these conversations, but then also developing this sense of a network of relationships, so that I think that the people from HD who have come out and identified as anthropologists have partly done that by identifying as Rick's student, as John's student, right? That they've done it by joining SPA, of setting up panels with other anthropologists that they met through the anthropology postdocs that came here, right? And I think that similar things have happened in clinical programs and academic psychology programs, where the kind of conversations that there is a space for here can develop the networks of relationships to bring those insights, and the insights themselves also carry weight, right? There's real contributions to a critique of individualism and collectivism to make that, because it's not a wrong direction to think that there might be some cultural piece of it, but we can together develop better answers that are really, and that those theories then are as strong as their explanative power, and we can make that evident to people. So that's what I would say.
I'm Richard Taub, and I was chair for the length of time of both Cage and Bambi here. And what I do want to say is a very different kind of point, not this conversation. Postdoc is a weird position in a university, and there are many ways you can do it. You can be some faculty member's pet and be off with them. You can go off into a corner. Bambi sort of suggested that as an option. Go off into a corner and write your change your dissertation into articles or a book. Or you can get involved in the department, and you can learn something by doing it. And what I would say is that in this group, I don't know the other two well. I think I was one of those one-year chairs when you were here. But Cage and Bambi represent the absolutely best models of what it is to be a postdoc and learn something in the process.
Unless you want to write your book efficiently.
But I think it should just be you should be identified as people who really came into the place, got involved, and had an impact. You learned, and you also brought something with you. And that is very rare in a postdoc situation, but it is something that all of you who are going to be postdocs at some point ought to think a lot about.
Thank you.
I think we need to move into
We
the
have-
right now, we're not breaking. I think we have one more.
Yes.
Okay, one more question. Andy, go ahead.
Thank you guys, thank you very much.